Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is poet and critic Mark Jarman, author of 12 poetry collections and 4 books of essays. His most recent book of poetry is Zeno's Eternity, published in 2023. Jarman's numerous awards for poetry include a Joseph Henry Jackson Award, 3 grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, and a fellowship from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. Jarman is the Centennial Professor of English Emeritus at Vanderbilt University. Jarman gave a reading at the University of Oregon on May 2nd, 2024, as a guest of the Creative Writing Program. Thank you, Mark, for coming on the show. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. So first, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to your vocation. How did you become a poet?
My background, I almost feel as if the kind of person who would understand my background is someone who is an army child. My father was a preacher in a denomination in which congregations called you, so he was never in one place very long. I was born in Kentucky, where he was in seminary. But he and my mother were from Los Angeles, and as soon as I was old enough, they moved back to California, to Southern California, where he served a church. And then when my dad was about 30, he also, I think, was kind of a gadabout. He got the urge to live abroad, not something that a minister on his pay could necessarily do, but he took a church in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, which is a linoleum factory town at that time. It still sort of is, on the Firth of Forth. Not the pretty part of Scotland. So it was around the corner from it. And that's where I kind of came to consciousness, went to school, learned to read and write. Or they would say do sums. My younger sister also. I have 2 younger sisters. The youngest was born back in California when we returned. That's a formative time for me. And I returned to Scotland in my poetry, and I've returned many times with my family as an adult. So that was formative. Being a minister's son certainly was. Being taught how to memorize scripture, which is my father was very good at. My grandfather, his father supposedly knew the whole Bible by heart, but he actually knew some important passages by heart. I have a record of him reciting by heart. I don't know why you need to know this. I need to say it. I have a record of my granddaddy reciting passages from the Bible by heart. It was like an icon in our family. And then when I was old enough, I had a best friend, I still do, who I played the record for. He said, "Listen, you can hear pages turning."
Oh.
So that was the central aspect of our lives. It was the church, the calling of my father and grandfather, which I thought would be my calling too, until I really understood what a calling was, which was not that. So I found myself called, if anything, into teaching when I was finishing college, and I had already started writing poetry as a young teenager. It's just something I would do. I had a grandmother who was a writer, and we all respected her, that this was a kind of a thing. Well, Grandma Nora wrote, and we always sent her a book or something about writing on her birthday or at Christmas. And I always visit her as a little child. I think these are all formative things. As a child, and I would listen to what she had written. She would say, Mark, I want you to listen to this. I'm writing a story, and I like to hear how it goes, or I've written a poem, I want you to hear it. So one of the first poems, one of my poems in my first book is called Writing for Nora, and it's about listening to her read. So I'd say that was the kind of thing that basically no one in my family said it's wrong to do this. My father, as a minister, didn't make any money, so nobody was going to say you're not going to make any money. But I was lucky to be living at a time in a country that said, you can teach for us and write poetry, and you can teach creative writing. So none of this is seamless, but that's kind of how I came to do that. And I think my first book of poetry was mainly about my childhood in Scotland, and I called it North Sea. And subsequent books of poetry have been increasingly about my background, my Christian background. And even my most recent book, Zeno's Eternity, is a sense of trying to look back at classical roots of Christianity, Stoicism, and the Zeno of my title, Zeno's Eternity, it refers to the Zeno who made the paradoxes, but there was another Zeno who was a Stoic. And in my mind, and in this book, they are conflated. So that aspect of understanding my makeup, understanding that aspect of my life. My wife and I met in college. And she was a singer, a vocalist, and Jewish. And so that was an interesting thing for my family. But the only person who protested was a grandmother who was an anti-Semite, so nobody cared about that. So Amy is a singer, and I write poetry, and we managed to eventually, after going here and there, to be hired at Vanderbilt University, where I've just retired, and she actually has just retired. But for years, she taught in the music school, and I taught in the English department, taught creative writing. And we made a life for ourselves in Nashville, Tennessee, both of us from Southern California. All of this has to do with, and we have two grown daughters, but all of this is fed into my poetry, and it emerges here and there. I feel as if it's something that just naturally comes about. I'd say this is one of the first books I've written where I've thought, I'm interested in this Stoicism, the Stoic philosophy, but also the nature of paradox. And here I am. I don't know.
Here you are.
That's probably more than you wanted to know.
So, Mark,
conflated a lot.
at this point, could I ask you to read a poem from?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you what. I will read the poem, the first poem from this book that I wrote, which is dealing with one of Zeno's paradoxes, well, sometimes called the arrow paradox. And if you know a little bit about it, almost everybody runs into this because the paradoxes are so interesting. An arrow can never reach its intended mark. It has too many marks to meet on the way. It's almost, the only thing I can compare it to is if you've had algebra, you know about the betweenness theory. There are an infinite number of points between 2 points. And for Zeno, who is basically amusing his fellow philosophers, posited that, for example, if you set a tortoise out for a competition of speed with Achilles, the tortoise will always stay ahead because Achilles has too many points he has to reach, and it's impossible. Of course, the paradox is in itself impossible. That's the beauty of it. So the arrow paradox was something similar, the arrow cannot reach its goal. And it kind of suggests to me two things. One, just the flight has meaning, and the arrow is in a kind of suspension, like an eternal present, which brings you back to the sense that you have in Christianity is, what is the nature of heaven? It is an eternal present. So, having said all that, this is the arrow paradox. Zeno sent his arrow flying endlessly from point to point along its arc to make a point about eternity. Getting there is tricky. That's what I think anyway. Snowflakes stalled in the morning's freezing air like seed fluff, reluctant to drop anchor in the ice. I'm watching that tentative descent through, though I'm in motion and counter motion, even as I follow my pen's blue notes and think I'm not doing anything, not going anywhere, much farther than my own flight across the blank momentum of the turning page. So an endless suspension, not necessarily negative, but because you're on your way somewhere, is, I realize, a sense of the way we experience daily life. I suppose even when we start to die. The other thing that interests me, should I read
Sure,
another
go
one?
ahead.
Okay. The other thing that interested me in the nature of belief or faith, about which I've often written, and sometimes I feel as if that's all I write about, is the sense of a kind of the brink of belief, the almost there. And I'm going to mention some names here, particularly my mother's name, Grace, who was very devout and very loving. And the name Alexander Campbell, who was one of the founders of the denomination I was brought up in, the Church of Christ. Though I was brought up in the Christian church, the more moderate part of it. In Nashville, which is like the Vatican City for the Church of Christ, if you are a follower of it, you are probably called a Campbellite. A Campbellite is better than no light at all. You'd learn that if you lived in Nashville. And someone else here, and Hans Kung, the great German philosopher, Catholic philosopher, who died just a few years ago, who has a wonderful book called On Being a Christian, and a book on faith. And though he is a ex-theologian, he's, I think, very readable. So I make references to them. This is called Almost. Almost grasped what Grandmother Grace knew last Sunday sitting in church. Almost knew what Alexander Campbell grasped when, confronted with the desolate orphan, he told her, "You are a child of God. Go seek your inheritance. Go claim your inheritance." Almost got it. There it was in the sunlight, squared in the clear glass windows, on the durable leaves of the magnolia outside. Almost grasped the weather that turns clear and crystallized in Hans Kung's brain. Almost held it in the ellipses and measure for my almost understanding. I see the moment there in my notebook, then the next day's anxiety spilling like something across the ink. I almost put in my hand a vast acceptance and almost blessed myself, then it slipped away. All that colossal animal vivacity, smoke of the distant horizon, most of it haze. But to have known in any place or time what they knew is worth a record. A few notes. Almost knew what they knew. Almost got it. I think that that goes along with that sense of, in the arrow paradox, of there's a sense that one is suspended in time to actually accomplish something, to get there, would be to finish it and lose it in a way too. Other things.
So let me ask you a couple of other questions. So almost 30 years ago, you and David Mason edited the anthology Rebel Angels, 25 Poets of the New Formalism.
Yeah.
So looking back, how do you understand what the New Formalism was or is and its significance?
Well, one of the things interesting about the term was that it was first used in a derogatory way about some younger poets back in the 70s who were beginning to, or continuing to write in traditional forms, in meter and rhyme, at a time when mainstream American poetry, anyway, had seemed to do away with them. So there were some poets who did not repudiate them. They continued to write in meter and rhyme, and there were some critics who derided this and referred to it as the new formalism, sort of like the new conservatism. In fact, that they were all, a number of them were compared to Reaganites. In fact, most of them were socialists and Marxists, but it wasn't that. It was just that the new formalism at first was one of those things that seemed to have this negative connotation, and some of us thought, well, let's just accept it. Let's call it that way. So when David Mason and I put together this anthology, we at first were going to include everybody, anything that was written in form, and we decided, no, let's stick with the 24 or so people who are writing this way and really taking and engaging it, and in a kind of way we thought was rebellious. So, in a sense, 25 Poets of the New Formalism describes them, sincerely. Rebel Angels is a little flippant, as if they were the rebel angels and not the rebel angels we know of in Paradise Lost. They were the one rebelling. So there was also a bit of criticism. Oh, no, we're the rebel angels, said the people not writing the poem. But I think it drew attention to how silly these categories were. You know, we're writing poetry, either one way or another way. I think that at this point, the new formalism has been successfully, I believe, assimilated by the whole poetry culture. Mm-hmm. My intent always was to suggest that if you're inclined in one way or the other, then you just follow it. That's what you do. There's nothing unnatural or retrograde about one or the other.
So how do you think of the questions of form now when you're writing poetry?
Well, I'm always interested in the question of form. But I'm not always writing what might be called in a form. And even when we put together that anthology, I practiced with more latitude than Dave did. Dave had written some really wonderful things in traditional form. I was a little more ambivalent about it. But I definitely thought a young poet especially should go any way he or she wanted to go. I look back on it in that way. I think, well, this has become a touchstone book. If it's known still, I don't know that it's still in print, but I was happy with it. I found a wonderful print we put on the cover by William Blake called "The Good and Evil Angels Fighting Over the Life of a Child." And so here's this terrifying looking figure coming out of the abyss, and the kind of Michelangelo-esque blonde statuing figure holding this baby. And they're supposedly the good and evil angels. And I thought, again, sort of cheekily, I'll bet the evil angel is the blonde giant holding the baby. Because knowing what I knew about Blake's sense of energy and the energy for evil being more passive and the angel for good being more aggressive. It was just, it's a dramatic cover. I think whoever has the rights to the book now has put different covers on it, which is too bad. Anyway, that's how I think about it now. I think though it may have seemed to be polemic, it was simply saying, let's consider this. And look at all these really talented poets who are working in this form.
Would you read us another?
Yeah. Why don't I read my Oregon poem,
The sonnet.
which is a sonnet, although what might be called a blank verse sonnet. I bet you marked it, and I just can't find it.
Near the end.
Yeah.
It's probably the last or the.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, these are the last section are poems of basically elegies for my parents. After my mother died about 22 years ago, my sister and I looked for a place to deposit her ashes. And when we were living in the Northwest for a long time, my parents liked to take us all camping to Cape Lookout, if we know that. Okay. So we decided we would find a place near Cape Lookout to deposit her ashes. So what we found at first, and it will say in the poem, we found in a place that wouldn't work until we found a place that would work. That's all I can say. This is a sonnet, but it's what might be called a blank verse sonnet. You won't hear any rhymes unless they're accidental. Near Cape Lookout. And it's a poem that sort of does what I think Horace, I think, or Virgil says, begin in medias res, in the middle of things. And that's where we begin. So we kept looking and found a little space spangled with fog milk, drooping asters, and coiled bending ferns, a sodden enclosure, no path there, but a steep, unfriendly view of water far below and hard, damp beach. Not the place for Mother that we'd hoped to find, but a woven shrine of wetness and hidden grasses. We did find our way down. The waves spread in. We scattered her from a teacup she had saved. And that bower, with its dewy microclimate, for all our stumbling in and stopping there, it may have been like a memory she'd kept and never told anyone of life before us, before any of us.
So you mentioned early in the interview that you discovered at first that your calling might be teaching. And you have been recently retired from Vanderbilt, but for most of your career you have been a teacher at Vanderbilt. Say a little bit about how you approach teaching creative writing, how you approach teaching poetry.
I have what sounds like a simple philosophy of creative writing, which is my students said, wherever I get them, I said, learn everything about the craft. Learn it all. then just be yourself. And in fact, I try to get people to see this craft, which is greatly detailed and comes with incredible history. Just to take one example, the history of the sonnet, just that, from the 15th century to the present. Get that all under your skin, how it's done, how it was done, what it is, what it's meant to do. And once you've learned all that, you have it, I said, under your skin, then just be yourself. You find that you will be. I say to students, I'll show them, say, a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, and they'll say, oh, I can't read that or do that. I want to sound original. Mm. And I assure them, no, you won't. You will never sound like Elizabeth Bishop, but you will have learned something from looking at her, or any great poet of style. There are some great poets of style, Dylan Thomas, that if you approach them, you will successfully sound like them, and it won't be good, you know. So that's the way I teach creative writing.
Would you read us one more?
Yeah, sure. Which one of the ones you've got, Mark Jarman?
The last.
End of Summer. I can't get through that. So that's another one about my mother. So can I read
Anyone
a different
you like.
one? Okay.
Yeah, anyone you like.
I'll read the one about my father. This is also an elegy for him. I was present. My sisters, we were all present when Dad died. I had never seen anyone, and he was a preacher, so he'd seen lots of people deceased and dying, but I'd never had until this moment, which was just extraordinary. And he died at home, and while we watched him die and die, I kept hearing that trite phrase, he died comfortably at home surrounded by family. Nobody dies comfortably. This is in the first minute without him. In the first minute without him, I felt love for what he left behind, though it was empty, and kissed his forehead and knew it would dissolve with all the rest in fire and memory. The last word he said to me was water, repeated 3 times, and I made a joke about what Christ got for his thirst, vinegar. I put the wet sponge to his hips and lips and stroked. Water had been his last word, and his first. No one is alive who might remember it. All dying may be a process of growing thirst. He beckoned with a curled finger at his mouth. I felt love and said to him, we loved you. Corrected myself and said it in present tense. He believed love transcended death or used to. He believed love was an extrasensory sense. Meanwhile where was he, if not lying there, still present, such a presence, we all said, his tall man's length and breadth, his preacher's pompadour, his daily need to tell the world he lived. Our Father, after whom we took the world as full of hope and promise, then like him as baffling when it ignored us when we called and needed to be found where we had hid. Our Father, who art somewhere now, we hope, although we have the proof of where he is, divided among us in separate memories and things that he loved, marked by his ownership. The minutes keep repeating, each without him. But if eternity is outside of time, there's no time like the present to imagine him, our Father, restored to memory and beyond. In the rented bed, in the sunlit sewing room, as a dusk rose from his open mouth and eyes. It was our shadow cast as we crowded around him, meeting his shadow, still falling on all of us.
Mark, thank you so much for sharing that poem. Thank you for sharing the other poems. I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. It's been a true pleasure speaking with you today. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, too. Thanks very much.
I've been speaking with poet Mark Jarman. Jarman gave a reading at the University of Oregon on May 2nd, 2024 as a guest of the Creative Writing Program. Thanks so much for watching.